Greetings to everybody. Greetings to yourself and to your team from the States. Greetings to everybody in Belgrade and everybody online. It is a pleasure and a privilege to join you today. Thank you very much to the invitation. And I've listened with fascination to some of the presentations, which are trying, I think, to grasp an understanding of where we are in the present world. I think that is the overarching feeling of where are we as individuals in this increasingly chaotic world that we're living in. I think that for many of us, from an academic perspective, many of the things that we spent our lives doing and the fundamental foundational principles which we believed in are being tested and questioned in ways which we were not prepared for. The word unprecedented is overused. And yet many of the challenges we're facing are unprecedented. And I think that if we are to take those concepts, those fundamental concepts, into a framework which is described and defined through the metaphor of the Silk Road, I think there are valuable lessons there for us. Because every generation, including our own generation, believes that we are the ultimate in human development. We think we are the most modern. We think we are the last. I remember my father coming home in the 1970s amazed by this thing called a fax machine. And somebody could send you a message from Australia. And where did the paper go? And of course, what we now consider as cutting edge in 25 years will be laughable. I mean, the idea that you have a mobile phone which you have to hold to your ear and you have to push buttons and the battery runs out and you need a signal. I mean, how did you live without that being embedded into your brainwaves, which is automatic? So, Mr. Victor, I'm I'm not sure, Victor, but I can see strange things on your camera. Thank you. So what we have at the moment is we believe that we're living at the cutting edge of human development. But that was true 2,200 years ago as well. And if we look at the development of what this thing called the Silk Road, and of course the Silk Road is a 19th century German idea. It wasn't called the Silk Road at the time. But if we take this concept of the Silk Road, from its beginning, about 200 years before the Christian era, about 1,700 years or so up until the start of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of about the 16th century in Europe. But if we take those 1,800 years, then I think we see actually many parallels to the world we're living in today. The first thing is, and I've deliberately titled my presentation, the first super information highway, because that exactly is what the Silk Road was. And of course, although we call it the Silk Road, it wasn't a road. It was a network of both maritime and trans-border pathways, mainly built around trade. It was around trade. But if we look at the areas in which it was operating in, that was genuinely the cradle of humanity as we believed it in the Western world anyway, but it is certainly the cradle of the culture that we are living in today. The cultural ideas, the religious ideas, the social ideas, the political ideas, they all arose within that bowl, that cultural bowl, that historical bowl, that geographical bowl, which brought together multiple cultures, multiple frameworks, multiple beliefs, and allowed them to mix, allowed them to be entropotic. It was basically a mixture, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-language. But if you look at the words, if you think of the cities of the Silk Road, you have Baghdad, Damascus, Zanzibar, Samarkand, Alexandria, Muscat, Goa. I think if you have a living heart within yourself, Andrew, I think you have to be moved by those names. Do you not have to be moved by those names? You cannot sit there and maintain a poker face. Those are words of joyful, wondrous. They are the world of unknown. We think of Afghanistan and Iran today. But in those days, Afghanistan was the land of riches. It was the lands of the mountains. It was where one lived a good life. It was where you could live a life of culture. You could live a life of relaxation. And from that It spread out. If we look at the way that culture moved across that central area, and of course, what's interesting is it moved two ways. It moved east towards China, and it moved west into Europe, basically. But what was interesting is Europe was only the second part of that adventure. When Alexander, in I think it was 316 BC, his father, Philip, who was a great emperor, had been assassinated. Alexander was a 16-year-old and became king of Macedonia. But when he looked for adventure, when he looked for lands to conquer, he looked east. He did not look west. There was nothing in Europe that was of interest. I mean, there was a few Germanic tribes running around the hills, but besides that, there was nothing. You wanted adventure, you wanted to challenge yourself, you went east, my friend. You went east. And I think that is a lesson for us. The trade routes were what carried Christianity and Hinduism and Islam around. You had great universities. You had libraries of the ancient times. You had philosophers. You had culture. You had industry. Silk. If somebody someday wants to do a PhD on what silk did for the Western world, I mean, it was epoch defining and epoch changing. Silk. There you go. So that's a good PhD project for somebody. But what it was about connectivity. We now find in the UK Roman remains which have jade. Well, jade doesn't come from Rome. So where does jade come from? Jade comes from somewhere else, and opal, and other stones and jewelry. And you can see the way that the cups are inscribed, or the mosaics. And you can literally see an individual mosaic designer moving across Europe, because as they move across Europe, so a new twist is given to what's there. And it's like a signature. You can actually see this individual person over 30 years moving across, and suddenly there'll be a new level of sophistication. This week, Elon Musk was in China. This week, Jamie Dimon was in China. It's interesting that Elon Musk is in China, given that Twitter is banned in China, but that's another story. And he didn't tweet from there, but nevertheless, if Elon Musk is in China, Jamie Dimon is in China, then they're there for a reason. And the reason that they are there is because the center of gravity is moving back east. In 2011, we have in the UK some place called the International Institute of Strategic Studies. And in 2010, 2011, they ran a series of programs bringing Chinese leaders across, Chinese sub-ministers, people, good people, over to England and say, right, let's meet you. We need to meet you. And they were nice people. They're good people. They spoke English, Harvard educated, Yale educated, nice people. You'd invite them over on a Saturday afternoon to your house for a drink. Good people. But the fundamental underlying question was, will China be a good neighbor? That was the question. They were beginning to become expansionist around the Asian Pacific Rim, looking at Vietnam, looking at Cambodia, looking at these Malaysia areas of influence. And the question was, will they be a good neighbor? And I was in the room, and somebody asked a deputy minister, if China is to join the global community, are you prepared to play by the rules? And the minister, who was a smart man, looked around the room and went, whose rules? They're your rules, my friend. They aren't our rules. They aren't our rules. And what we consider now is that China is coming back into the global community. That is a historical error. The Chinese word for China is Chukoku, the central kingdom. And the fact that for the last 200, 250 years, European technology has allowed Europe to become the center of axis. That's a historical anomaly. Over the last 3,000 years, that is a historical anomaly. There is a famous story about, and you know what, as I said that, Andrew, help me out here. I forgot his name. But the Chinese guy who was in after Mao, but he was basically in China. And sorry, he was in Paris. He'd been in Paris, and he was a student in Paris, went back to China, became prime minister. And then he went back in Paris in 1971. And they said to him, it's a famous story. I need to remember his name. I'm getting old. But they asked him, was the French Revolution a good idea? And he famously said, too early to tell. Too early to tell. And everybody laughed, because that's 200 years ago. Actually, that story has been mistold thousands of times, because he thought that they were referring to the 1967 student revolution. That's what he thought they were referring to. So that story has been mistold millions of times around the world. And I still tell that story, even though I know what the true version is. I still think it's a good story. The thing about China is, it has a strategic perspective that none of us have, that we do not have in the West. You look at, for example, Taiwan, you look at Tibet, you know, they're 70 years in Tibet. They're only in the mid-game. They're quite happy to have that thing. So it seems to me that we in the West, what we call the West, of course, they don't recognize that as the West, but what we call the West, are having to engage with a fundamental question, which is that these tectonic plates of geopolitical engagement are shifting. And it's not only that we don't understand that, but we don't have a language or a metaphor to describe it. We don't have a metaphor to describe that. And I think that is a challenge that we need to face up to. Because the reality is that China's on the move. And when China's on the move, the world shakes. I mean, it really does. When President Nixon went to China in, I think, 1971, the day before, and this was in Kissinger's book about that, but the day before he went, he said to his advisors, give me something I can keep in my mind. Give me one thing to keep there. And he said, Mr. President, please remember, there is no concept in the Chinese language of compromise. There's only power. If I'm stronger than you, if I'm more powerful than you, why should I leave 30% on the table? Why should I take 100%, and if you want some, come and ask me, and maybe I'll give you some, maybe I won't. But why would I leave 30% on the table if I don't have to? That doesn't make sense. And from a Chinese perspective, we have seen in their geopolitical movements that still goes. And what we're seeing now in South China Sea, for example, even in the last week, we are seeing some very, very scary brinkmanship, very scary brinkmanship. We are seeing submarines literally going skin to skin, touching skin. We are seeing fighter planes going within meters of each other. It only takes one small miscalculation, one pretty junior, mid-ranking officer to push the wrong button at the wrong time. And we cannot rerun that video. We can't replay it. Andrew, if you can explain to your students afterwards what a video is, I'd appreciate it, because they probably don't know, but you know, that would be good. What was interesting is during the Cold War, from 1945 to 1991, not once did an American and a Russian soldier shoot each other. Not once, never. There was never an active engagement. There was a 1962 Gary Powers U-2 thing, but that was something else. But not once across all of the conflicts did a Russian soldier and an American soldier shoot. We are now getting to the stage, very closely, where the possibility of Chinese and American forces coming into what is called, percussive contact is a possibility. And there's a responsibility to walk away from that. In the 1980s, there was a concept called MAD, mutually assured destruction. And what it says is, in the concept of, or in the context of a nuclear standoff, I cannot defend myself against a nuclear attack. But what I can do is let you know, if you fry us, we will fry you. And for 30, 40 years, that worked. But that will only work if you're playing by the same rules. And if you're not playing by the same rules, you know, if you're in karate and you're doing semi-contact and the other guy is doing full contact, you better work that out before you get in the ring, my friend. Otherwise, you're going to get a shot. And I think that what we need to do is establish the rules. Make sure that we establish the rules. Make sure we change the rules. And that's a challenge. And if you ask me, well, how are we going to do that? I do not have an answer. I tell you that. But I think that's important. But I think that one of the things we can learn is this historical imperative, this historical perspective. We've been doing this for 2,500 years. Every generation believes that their generation has more criticality than any other generation's ever had. That's not true. I accept the challenge we're facing are pretty damn bad. But in terms of empires coming together, China was not the great empire. Persia was the empire. Persia was the great empire when Alexander was around. Persia was the empire, was always the empire. But we've always had empires. We've always had change of empires. That is what happens. And we're going through that now. We're moving from the Pax Americana, which was not actually very much, wasn't very Pax, but let's call it the Pax Americana. And we're moving into, I'm not sure what we call it. But we need to have a language and we need to have a metaphor to describe it. And I think that this forum is valuable. And I hope that the people listening to, the young people listening to this, some may be inspired. They may say, well, that is something that is worth doing. That was it. So those are my thoughts. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share that with you. Of course, I'm open to any questions or comments. And if anybody is interested in sharing ideas, I am, of course, on LinkedIn. I'll be delighted to hear from you. But thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your exceptionally interesting and slightly alarming presentation, but perhaps maybe I should use the word realistic rather than alarming. But the more we engage, the more we understand about each other and about the more we are able to move out of our own little worlds into the larger world and see what is going on and establish relationships, then the better off we will be.
Andrew, I mean, you used the word culture. You said culture is complex systems. And if you're dealing with any complex systems, you have to have people who understand complexity, because yes, complexity brings a new issue to the game. And yes, if you don't understand complexity, whether it's climate change or whether it's geoeconomics, then you're missing something. And I think that these sorts of forums exactly does that to
yes,
engage with that.
And of course, the idea of a system as well. I was trained as a systems scientist by one very wonderful teacher that I had, who said, you know, the whole point is we ignore the system at our peril, because the system is, forget the complexity, just the fact that it is a system, we cannot tinker without knowledge, because then we get ourselves in trouble.